I think it's more important today than it's ever been, and I think there's a number of key issues in there. If we start at the top and think about the complexity of most organisations, most organisations rely on a third party to deliver services for them. Actually, the model over the past 10 years has been to outsource even more, so actually it's even bigger. But what perhaps we don't think about is that third party has a third party, and we end up with a really complex ecosystem around a company. When the ecosystem is that complex, you end up with points of failure all over the place. So the likelihood of there being a crisis increases. Crises used to be managed behind closed doors, right? And so another thing that's changed is the level of scrutiny. And that could be, from the press, from the public. In today's world of instant news, companies are judged publicly and sometimes verbally on Facebook, etc., as to how they manage that crisis. Really good example was the CrowdStrike challenge, let's call it. They gave their partners £10 Starbucks vouchers. That was all over Facebook in about 5 minutes flat. So people have opinions and they're not afraid to voice them these days. So there's a lot more scrutiny on crises. Almost all of the regulators today talk about operational resilience, and crisis management is part of that. How do we continue to operate the organisation in times of difficulty? And there are more times of difficulty, right? And then I think the final one is technology and cyber. From a technology perspective, back to the CrowdStrike piece, most companies today are technology, digital and data companies, whether they like it or not. Now, what the truth is that most of them haven't woken up to that, and they've still got some work to do to get that. So the technology environment is incredibly complicated and mostly third parties. And then if you look at the cyber threats, WannaCry across the globe in 24 hours. So these things happen rapidly. I think people confuse plan and planning, which is the first point, I think. The plan is as a result of planning. It sounds really obvious, right? But actually there's a bunch of things that an organisation needs to do to plan for a crisis. So the first part is risk assess their organisation. Where are the key risks within an organisation? And then how do we mitigate those? The best solution to crisis management is never to be in crisis in the first place, right? So we can fix those. Then it's about having the right team with the right culture, the right skill set, so the crisis management team, okay? And I've seen a real mix over the years of very junior teams, very senior teams. I think there's an honest conversation to be had in most organisations about who are the right people to be in our crisis management team. At the moment, in a lot of places, it's by virtue of role. That doesn't always make them the right person. So some serious thought about that. And also within those teams, having enough diversity of thought to be able to look at a single crisis from multiple angles and come up with a full spectrum response. If we move on to the comms plan, I talked previously about how crises tend to be managed in public these days. Having a strong comms plan, being open and honest, being able to talk to your shareholders, talk to the public, talk to your customers in a way that's meaningful and makes sense and has already been thought through, as opposed to on the hoof at 3 o'clock in the morning. How do we respond? What's our approach to response? How are we going to manage it? Who should be involved? Okay, these are all parts of the plan that we need to build. Training. So how do we train our people to manage a crisis? A lot of organisations tend to default to, well, it's their day job. Well, it's not. Okay, there's a lot of parts that go into managing a crisis beyond, this is my day job, and all of that needs to be thought through. So how do we make sure that people have got the right training, the practice, the crisis response plan, everybody's comfortable. And then recovery. Thinking about recovery. How do we know when the crisis is over? Sounds really, really obvious, right? Well, it's over, isn't it? That's not really true. What tends to happen with a crisis will begin normally with a bunch of incidents, and those incidents tend to be precursors to a crisis. Ideally, we deal with them at the incident stage, sometimes we can't. But actually, at the end of a crisis, okay, when we've got our crisis criteria, at the end of that crisis, to be able to say, right, okay, we're moving from crisis, but actually what we do is move back to incident. What you tend to have off the back of a crisis is a number of incidents that you still need to close down. So how do we do that? And then how do we recover the organisation back to where it was previously? And then the final one really is continual improvement. It's the one that everybody overlooks. So we've had a crisis. How did we do? How did we manage the crisis? What were our responses like? Did they make sense? Where did it go well? Where did it go badly? And importantly, how can we build back better based on what we've learned? Start at the top, lack of preparation. So we just talked about planning versus plan. They're two slightly different things. One's a product of the other, but just overall lack of preparation. You have a plan, it sits on the shelf. You know, when's the last time they got it out? Most plans, I'll look at the first page and look at the contact list. 90% of it's normally out of date. So preparing and planning correctly, really, really important. I think the second one with most organizations, a lot of organizations, certainly in mid-market, is it won't happen to us. We're not important enough. In fact, I was in a client the other day who said exactly that, until I pointed out that they're part of a number of other companies' third-party ecosystem. So it isn't just about them in isolation. It's about who they serve and who they support and how all of that fits together. Another mistake is recognizing you're in crisis quick enough. There's a human nature piece where we tend to sit back and stay away from it for as long as we possibly can. What you actually need to do as part of your planning process is work out what your crisis criteria are, okay? So that when it comes to an incident, that's normally how it begins, that starts to get out of hand. You can look at your crisis criteria and go, actually, we've passed these thresholds now. We're now in crisis. As opposed to, no, we can manage it. No, we can't manage it, and it's too late. And I think the final one, we talked about continuous improvement, is ignoring the lessons. So you've been in crisis, you've managed the crisis, you've closed out the crisis, you've recovered, you've done your continual improvement process. What should then happen with that post-crisis report is it should go to the board. Okay, the board is overall responsible for the strategic direction of the company. And within that post-crisis report, there'll be a bunch of lessons. And then the question is, how do we address those lessons and actually doing it? What tends to happen is we have a crisis, we close it down, everybody goes back to their day job. Lessons are rarely identified and very, very rarely learned. And then we make the same mistakes over and over again.